Master your triggers. How to respond instead of react. Someone says something, and before you have even finished processing it, you have already responded. Not thoughtfully. Not deliberately. Automatically. A comment from a colleague and your jaw tightens. A message from a family member and your mood collapses. A situation does not go the way you expected, and suddenly you are saying things, doing things, feeling things that the calmer version of you would never choose. This is what it means to be triggered. And if you are honest with yourself, it happens more than you would like. More than you think is acceptable for someone who considers themselves self-aware and in control. The good news is that being triggered is not a character flaw. It is a pattern. And patterns can be changed. This audiobook is about learning to respond instead of react. Not by suppressing what you feel, but by building the space between the trigger and your response wide enough that you get to choose what happens next. That choice is everything. Let's begin. Chapter 1. What a trigger actually is. Most people think of a trigger as something external. A person who pushes your buttons. A situation that sets you off. A comment that gets under your skin. And while those things are real, they are not actually the trigger. They are the spark. The trigger is what is already inside you waiting to be ignited. A trigger is an unresolved wound meeting a present moment situation that resembles it closely enough to activate the same response. Think about that for a moment. When someone criticizes your work and you feel a disproportionate surge of anger or shame, the intensity of that reaction is rarely about the criticism itself. It is about every other time you felt criticized and powerless. Every time your worth felt conditional on your performance. Every time you were made to feel that who you are was not enough. The present moment pulled the pin on something that was already loaded. This is why two people can experience the exact same comment and have completely different reactions to it. One person shrugs. The other is devastated for hours. The difference is not the comment. It is the history each person brings to it. Understanding this changes everything about how you approach your triggers. Because if your triggers are rooted in unresolved history rather than present reality, the work is not just about managing your reactions in the moment. It is about understanding what the reaction is actually pointing to. That's the key. Your triggers are not your enemy. They are information. They are a map to the parts of yourself that still need attention. Chapter 2. The Anatomy of a Reaction. Between the trigger and the reaction, something happens. It is fast. So fast that most people never notice it. But it is there. And learning to see it is the first step toward changing it. Here is the sequence. Something happens in your environment. Your brain scans it for threat. If it matches a pattern your brain has learned to associate with danger, physical or emotional, your amygdala fires. Stress hormones flood your system. Your heart rate rises. Your thinking narrows. And your body is ready to fight, flee, or freeze before your conscious mind has had a chance to weigh in. This entire process takes milliseconds. By the time you are aware of what is happening, you are already in a reactive state. And from that state, the responses that feel most natural are almost always the ones you will regret later. This is not a personal failing. This is a biological system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The problem is that it was designed for a world where threats were physical and immediate. It was not designed for the complexity of modern relationships, professional environments, and emotionally loaded conversations. Your brain cannot distinguish between a genuine threat to your safety and a threatening tone of voice in a meeting. It responds to both with the same urgency. And that urgency, unchecked, produces reactions that are disproportionate, damaging, and completely at odds with who you want to be. But here is what matters. Between the trigger firing and the reaction landing, there is a gap. It is small, but it exists. And with practice, that gap can be widened. Not enough to eliminate the stress response, but enough to insert a choice. That gap is where your power lives. And the entire practice of mastering your triggers is about learning to find it, widen it, and live inside it long enough to respond rather than react. Chapter 3. The most common triggers and what they reveal. While triggers are deeply personal, certain categories show up consistently across most people's lives. Recognizing yours is one of the most valuable things you can do. The first is disrespect. For many people, feeling dismissed, talked over, ignored, or treated as less than is one of the most reliable triggers there is. The reaction it produces, defensiveness, anger, withdrawal, or overcompensation, is almost always disproportionate to the actual incident. Because it is not really about the incident. It is about a much older and deeper need to be seen and valued. The second is loss of control. When situations do not go the way you planned, when people do not behave the way you expected, when uncertainty replaces the certainty you were counting on, the reaction for many people is anxiety that quickly turns into frustration or anger. Control is a way of managing fear. And when it is taken away, the fear surfaces in the form of a trigger. The third is comparison and inadequacy. When someone else's success, praise, or visibility activates a feeling of being less than, the triggered response often looks like resentment, dismissiveness, or a sudden compulsive need to prove yourself. None of which serves you. All of which points to an unresolved question about your own worth. The fourth is abandonment and rejection. For people with a history of relationships where love or acceptance felt conditional or unreliable, perceived rejection is one of the most powerful triggers possible. A short reply, a cancelled plan, a shift in someone's tone. Any of these can activate a response that feels completely out of proportion to what actually happened. None of these triggers make you weak or damaged. They make you human. But knowing which ones are most active in your own life gives you the ability to prepare for them, recognize them in real time, and respond to them with intention rather than automation. You have a choice. Stay unconscious of your patterns and keep repeating them, or shine a light on them and start changing them. Chapter 4: The Practice of Responding. Knowing your triggers is step 1. Building the capacity to respond rather than react is step 2. And it is a practice, not a one-time insight. The first tool is the physiological pause. When you feel a trigger activating, the single most effective immediate intervention is to slow your breathing. One long exhale. Not because it solves the problem, but because it directly interrupts the stress response at the physiological level. It buys you seconds. And seconds are enough to widen the gap. Pair this with a physical anchor if possible. Pressing your feet into the floor. Feeling the weight of your body in the chair. These are not relaxation techniques. They are grounding tools that pull your nervous system back into the present moment and out of the threat response that the trigger activated. The second tool is the name it to tame it practice. Research in neuroscience shows that simply labeling an emotion reduces its intensity. When you can say to yourself, even silently, I am feeling triggered right now, or this is my inadequacy pattern activating, you're engaging the prefrontal cortex, the rational part of your brain, and reducing the dominance of the amygdala. Naming what is happening does not make it disappear, but it creates just enough distance between you and the reaction that a choice becomes possible. The third tool is the response delay. Give yourself a rule. Before you respond to anything that has triggered you, a minimum of 5 minutes must pass. Not to avoid the conversation. Not to suppress what you feel. Just to ensure that when you do respond, you are responding from your values rather than from your wounds. In practice, this might mean saying, I need a moment before I respond to this. It might mean stepping away from the keyboard before sending the message. It might mean sleeping on it before having the conversation. 5 minutes. That is often the difference between a reaction you regret and a response you respect. Chapter 5: The Person You Become When You Master Your Triggers. There is a version of you that exists on the other side of this work. And it is worth being specific about what that version looks like. Because it is not just about having fewer regrettable moments, although that is part of it. The person who has done the work of mastering their triggers moves through the world differently. Difficult conversations become navigable rather than explosive. Criticism becomes information rather than attack. Other people's behavior loses its power to destabilize your entire day. Your relationships deepen. Because the people closest to you no longer have to manage around your reactions. Because you can hear hard truths without shutting down or striking back. Because the intimacy that comes from genuine emotional safety becomes possible in a way it never was when your triggers were running the show. Your professional effectiveness increases. Because you can stay present and strategic in high-pressure situations where reactive people lose their composure and their credibility. Because you can receive feedback without ego and deliver it without cruelty. Because the trust that comes from being consistently calm and considered is one of the most valuable professional assets you can possess. And perhaps most importantly, your relationship with yourself improves. Because you stop carrying the guilt and shame of reactions you wish you could take back. Because you start to trust yourself in difficult moments. Because the evidence accumulates, slowly and privately, that you are someone who can handle what life brings without being overwhelmed by it. This is not a destination you arrive at and then maintain effortlessly. Triggers do not disappear. New ones emerge as life changes and new pressures arise. The work is ongoing, but the direction is clear. Every time you pause instead of react, you are building something. Every time you name what you are feeling instead of acting it out, you are building something. Every time you choose your response instead of defaulting to your pattern, you are building something. A life that is directed by your values, rather than driven by your wounds. That is what mastering your triggers actually gives you. Not the absence of feeling. The presence of choice. You have always had that choice. Now you know how to use it. Let's wrap it up. Your triggers are not going away. But your relationship to them can change completely. Every pause you practice is building new wiring. Every moment you choose response over reaction is proving to yourself that you are not at the mercy of your patterns. Every time you name what you feel instead of becoming it, you are reclaiming the part of yourself that gets to decide who you are in the moments that matter most. Here is your challenge. This week, when you feel triggered, do not ask what is wrong with that person. Ask what is this activating in me. That single shift in question will teach you more about yourself than years of avoiding the answer. You are not your reactions. You are the person who gets to choose what comes next. Thank you for listening to Akor Minds. Subscribe for more and share this with someone who needs to hear it today.